Good morning and good afternoon, depending on where you are. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Amy Berman, and I am the Deputy Director of the National Academy of Education. On behalf of the Academy, I want to thank our dedicated steering committee, our amazing and hardworking authors, many of whom you will hear from today, and the Sparner Balanced Assessment Consortium, our funder, for making this volume possible. And lastly, but very importantly, my two co-editors, Ed Harville and Jim Pellegrino, who provided so much of the wisdom and guidance for this volume. We hope that for those of you struggling with questions of comparability, it provides useful and relevant information. On that note, I'm going to turn the discussion over to Ed Harville to lead us in the introduction and set the agenda for today's session.
Thank you, Amy. And thanks to the National Academy of Education, as well as to the Smarter Balanced Assessment Consortium for their sponsorship of this National Academy's project. Next, thank you for this slide. These questions here illustrate those asked by various users of assessment data. Note that they all take it as a given that lower scores mean less proficient, similar scores mean similarly proficient, higher scores mean more proficient. Scores going up is good news, scores going down is bad news. But as measurement professionals and savvy test users know, this basic comparability assumption may not hold. There are many threats to score comparisons, and the specifics of comparing scores in different ways for different purposes with appropriate caveats can raise thorny technical and policy questions. Next slide. This volume focuses on large-scale assessments operating across jurisdictions and student populations. The authors address the amounts and types of flexibility in assessment content and procedures that can be allowed while still maintaining sufficient score comparability to meet the various needs of various stakeholders. Today, you'll hear from authors of each of chapters 2 through 9. As you can see, they explore a host of issues ranging from comparisons among individual students' scores on a single test, to group comparisons on a single test, to more complex score comparisons within a single assessment system, next slide, to comparisons across multiple assessment systems. Chapters 6 through 8 then turn to specific issues involving scores for English language learners, scores for students with disabilities, or involving comparisons among students from different linguistic or cultural backgrounds. The final cross-cutting chapter lays out a spectrum of conditions supporting stronger versus weaker comparability claims and offers some further practical guidance. We hope this book provides progress toward more valid and useful assessment, promoting equity, fairness, greater educational opportunity, and better learning outcomes. We'll hear next from the chapter authors, followed by a recap by Jim Pellegrino, who joined Amy Berman and me as co-editors. We've planned a little time at the end of the session to take your questions. Thank you.
So now we're turning it over to Brian Gong, one of the co-authors of chapter 2.
Good morning or good afternoon. I'm glad to be here and presenting the chapter that was written by my colleague Charlie DePascali and myself. It's on the comparability of individual students' scores on quote unquote the same test. Next slide, please. When we, as Ed mentioned, when we talk about comparability, one of the main expectations is that the student scores are expected to be interchangeable. That is, that the student would receive the same score supporting the same interpretation if the student took a different form of the test or if the student took the test under different conditions that were identified as permissible by the test developer and test sponsor. Fundamentally, comparability is a question of validity, reliability, precision, and fairness. Next slide. The chapter addresses the purposes, the variety of cases where the same test may actually have a number of variations, processes for establishing the comparability of individual student scores on the same test, common threats to comparability, and how to evaluate whether comparability is sufficient to support a particular inference or test use. Of course, I won't be able to go into all these points in depth. I'll try to hit some of the main points of the chapter today. Next slide. we identified three main purposes that individual student scores may be used. The second one is the one that large-scale assessment is used most widely for, particularly in state summative assessments, where student scores are reported in relation to fixed standards such as a level of proficiency or and a cut score. Next slide. It would be simple to, or simpler to talk about comparability if the same tests were given, the same exact tests were given to all the students at exactly the same time under the same testing conditions. But in fact, in our modern testing, that's quite rare. It's usual to have different forms. We might have multiple operational forms, matrix sampled forms. We may have field test items that are inserted into multiple forms. They also may be matrix. We may have computer adaptive tests with many forms. We may have different formats of test administration, notably paper and pencil and computer-based. And in computer-based, we may have many different devices that each may influence or represent a different testing condition. We have forms that are administered at different times, such as a retest, where we may have a student take a test, and then if they don't pass it, they're allowed to take a retest at a later point in time, or some programs allow students to take a test in the fall when they've completed a block schedule course, and then we want to compare those to scores perhaps taken later in the spring. Also, every large-scale state testing program has accommodations, which are variations in either the test items or the administration conditions that are allowed to support valid interpretations. And these accommodations are designed to reduce construct irrelevant variance. And so they're different from the other variations because these are differences that are necessary to support valid interpretations. Just in terms of different tests, you can read the bullets, but I wanted to call attention to the last one. We may have exactly the same test. In this case, we're comparing to the spring 2019 grade 8 reading test. But if we release that test so that it's available and someone else administered it, we would have exactly the same items, but actually the conditions would be different. Maybe not the test administration conditions, but the stakes probably would be different. Next slide. When we're trying to produce comparable individual student test scores, it requires two things: a thoughtful combination in design and then psychometric procedures. In the test design, the development, construction, administration, and specifications, that requires a deep understanding of the construct, the content, and the assessment, so that those together can be combined so that we know that it's actually supporting valid interpretations, but also then when deviations from that are likely to impact the measurement of either the construct or the comparability of student scores. So in our non-standardization, or in our continuum of standardization, where we're having exactly the same to something less than exactly the same, our test specifications will say what variations are acceptable. It may be something about the types of items, the item sampling through the content, the timing, the use of accommodations, scoring procedures, and so on. Next slide. there are well-developed psychometric procedures to help ensure comparability scoring. I just put here a summary from Paul Hall and Neil Duran's central work on equating and linking about requirements for equating. In most of our large-scale assessments, we may not fulfill all the requirements for strict equating, but these aspects should be checked and usually are checked. Next slide. So what are some of the threats to comparability? There are altered purposes in different claims. I'll come back to that in a minute. We may change the design specifications. That sometimes happens over time, but one of the more interesting situations now is that we may have consortia or vendors that are allowing different design specifications within sort of a family of assessments, and yet trying to maintain the scale and the comparability. We may have non-standardized test administrations. I mentioned devices here. One of the studies that our group was involved in, we found that there was a tremendous range of devices, and simple things like screen resolutions might affect the student performance and comparability of scores. Currently, we're talking about remote administration as another challenge to what a comparable test administration or test administration that might support comparable scores might be. There may be changes in psychometric processes and criteria, particularly over time or across different vendors, and scoring, particular hand scoring. There's always variation across scorers, and then additional threat is if there are variations across time, across sets of scores. It's also true that vendor scanning, when we do machine scoreable things, in fact, vendors may have different criteria that they use in order to do optical mark recognition and so on. And as we move to more automated scoring or machine AI-supported scoring, of course, there can be differences in vendors or systems or criteria across that. So scoring is also can be a threat to comparability. Under assumptions and initial conditions, there are 4 that were listed there. The differences in intended use of test results, there can be changes in the stakes, which would change the motivation, but also if it's it could be something like a practice test where there's a combination of familiarity with the format as well as the stakes. And I already mentioned that there can be differences among assessment contractors because of the test delivery platform and other procedures. Next slide. One of the most interesting threats to comparability is if we have changes in the purposes or claims or intended interpretations. I put an example here with just 4 different claims that are slightly different, but you can see how the evidence required for each of those is a different type of evidence in terms of generalization to different circumstances or beyond what may have been collected on the test. So we may start with a test, but if we start changing the use of it or the intended interpretation, then we may have a threat to comparability because we're using it differently. Last slide, please. We don't have time to talk about the processes of evaluation, but the most important things I thought were to note that we have a lot of resources, professional standards, tools, criteria, and traditions of professional practice to help those who are responsible for developing, administering, scoring, reporting, and using test scores in order to make informed decisions regarding test score comparability about individual students. However, this was from over 20 years ago, it was a good reminder from the NRC committee that whether comparability is enough is a matter of policy and professional judgment. Their quote was, ultimately, policy decisions and educators must take responsibility for determining the degree to which they can tolerate imprecision in testing and linking. And responsible people may reach different conclusions about the minimally acceptable level of precision in linkages or in other aspects of test comparability that are intended to serve various goals. We hope that this chapter and volume on comparability will help support these informed decisions and uses. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Brian. So now we are moving from comparability of individual student test scores to comparability of aggregated group scores. I turn it over to Leslie King.
Yes, good morning, everyone. And just want to also acknowledge my co-authors on this paper, Dr. Scott Marion at the Center for Assessment, as well as Dr. Susan Lyon, who contributed to this chapter as well. So yeah, this chapter builds on what Brian and Charlie's chapter were about, and of course extends it now to the aggregate level, talking about group scores. And I can say in my own professional experience, we spent a lot of time focusing on making sure that the comparability of individual scores, sometimes making adjustments as needed, specifically in the context of, for instance, when you switch from paper to online or have mixed mode testing. And oftentimes we do kind of do forget about that, the truth that there is also comparability that's needed at the group level. And next slide, please, if you will, Amy. Just to show you kind of an example of why group level comparability may be important for us to consider. Let's assume right now that we do have for the same test, and we put same test in quotes here, that we have all the conditions that show that the comparability at the student level are met for a specific test. Let's just say it's a grade 8 reading test. And then you see the following performance for a school A, across 2 years. And if you focus on these stats you see here, you can see that between the 2 years, there's an average score increase, a significant average scale score increase, as well as in terms of proficiency rate. So what conclusion will you draw about School A's performance across these 2 years? Well, on the surface, you may say, wow, the School A may be ready to have a celebration about the amount of score increases they've had. But the first thing that's kind of a smoking gun is look at the number of students that have dropped between year 1 and year 2. Something is going down there in that school. And Amy, if you go to the next slide, please. Also, if we dig down deeper, let's look at the demographics of School A between the 2 years. Here you could see that school between the 2 years, there's a significant reduction in the number of students who are on free and reduced price lunch. Also, the number of special education students and English learners have dropped significantly. So, with all that information in mind, what conclusions could you now draw about School A's performance? And of course, we already said at the individual level, there's evidence to show that the individual level scores are comparable. But as you can see here, because of the shifting population, it would be erroneous to draw a conclusion that School A has made significant increase in its performance, even though its average scale score and proficiency rates would indicate so. So this is just an example that shows you different threats to group level comparability, even if you have student level comparability. Next slide, please. So what are the factors that could affect group level comparability? And this is what our chapter attempts to address. Next slide. So this is an outline of our chapter. Just like as Brian couldn't dive deep into his chapter, we won't be able to dive deeply into all the nuances of our chapter. So I'll give a quick scan of some of the key points in each of our sections. So you can see our section is divided into, our chapter is divided into 5 main sections. Next slide, Amy. So in the introduction, you just saw the opening introduction to our chapter. And of course, what we want to do, just like with the previous chapter, we want to frame our discussion in terms of purposes and uses. And then for group level comparability, we propose 4 main purposes and uses that are often used that require group level comparability. They include monitoring population trends and patterns, comparing subgroup performances at specific time period points and over time, and evaluation of curriculum, and instruction interventions and other programs, And finally, of course, accountability at various levels, whether that be teacher, school, or districts. So we frame that, our discussion with those purposes and uses in mind. Next slide, Amy. Then, of course, we look at, when it comes to group level comparability, often we're looking at derived scores, so scores that combine individual scores. We look at some measures of central tendency, such as mean and average, such as averages and medians and means. We look at measures of variability that could affect comparability. And we actually have a discussion about effective weighting versus policy or nominal weighting, which often plays key into the comparability discussion. We look at criterion-based measures, growth and value-added scores, and also the use of multiple derived scores and how that fits into the comparability discussion. The crux of our chapter is actually in terms of factors that affect group level comparability. And I think this is hopefully where we bring in some really practical issues from real assessment contexts. The example we used at the start of this presentation shows you how variation in group sizes and composition could affect group level comparability. We also examined how assessment conditions can affect group level comparability. And of course, we wrote this chapter before all the recent impact of the pandemic, but this is certainly something that will be very prevalent for many assessment programs and states to consider as the conditions or the context of assessment is certainly changing due to this COVID, especially in the upcoming school year. So hopefully some of the points raised there will be relevant there for the current context as well. There's also variation in the composition of the assessment, and this addresses some of the common things we see when assessments make slight changes and still want to maintain trend lines across years at the group level. So for instance, removal of a writing test, the writing component of the ELA test would be an example of, can you still maintain and make comparable claims at the group level with those changes? We also discussed variation in administration and scoring procedures. For instance, when a program changes vendors or when a program changes from, say, a fixed length test to a computer adaptive test, those could also have implications to group level comparability. Finally, we also have a discussion about differential item and test functioning, how individual item diffs diff or DTF that you see could actually aggregate and lead to comparability issues at the group level as well. Next slide. Of course, hopefully our chapter wants to be more than just raising issues. We actually want to also provide some really practical advice or suggestions. So we propose a framework that states and programs could use to support comparability claims. If you mind going to the next slide, Amy. And this is just a high-level overview of the framework we provide, and we actually provide an actual example from a program to walk you through how this framework could apply. The basic takeaway message from this framework is that prevention is better than cure. So what we're proposing here is, as programs set out to design their assessment program for the purpose of comparability, you want to start with the planning phase and working closely with various groups. Think about how the system could be designed to yield comparable results. How you would evaluate as you roll out your program the comparability and whether these conditions whether the conditions are being met. Of course, if changes occur and then there is a threat to comparability, how can adjustments be made? And finally, how can you communicate these results to the public so that the results of these scores, so that the results are being used in a valid way and not being misused or misinterpreted. Again, there's a lot more detail in the chapter that goes into this framework with a working example, along with some details that were more details to the points that we just made. And I think that's it. Yes, that's it. And yeah, so again, encourage you to read this chapter and find out more details about group level comparability.
Thank you so much, Leslie. Now I'm going to turn it over to Richard Wolf, who will be talking about comparability within a single assessment system.
I think you're still muted, Richard.
How about that one? Is that better? Okay. Um, let's just move to the next slide so I don't get behind here. We're dealing with these kinds of assessments, the state assessments and assessments from the consortia, and sort of NAEP as the mothership of all assessments. And these have in them the characteristic that they're really based on student testing and student reporting. That I would, say one thing, there are different purposes for the student testing and reporting, end of year and interim and growth and things. But I would argue that there's no such thing as a low stakes test. Tests that get reported back to students and their families are sort of inherently high stakes. They're aggregate analyses and for classrooms and schools and so forth. But these are not necessarily just simple averages or tabulations of the individual results. They could be more complicated and interesting things. They could be more detailed in terms of subtests, for example, than that is feasible at the individual level. So next slide, please. The fundamental thing that we want to look at is the content of the test. So what differentiates tests and what makes them compatible or incompatible is mostly in the content. And the question would be, what makes one math test different from another? And it's mostly that of content. This content framework comes from the TIMS study, 1995 study, that develops a three-dimensional view of the mathematics content, of the content itself and expanded versions of that, of the performance expectations, and of perspectives that are taken. This content framework was used as a multidimensional multi-attribute, that is, you can have more than one code for each of the different dimensions, for the curricula and for the textbooks and for the test items. And it was used as well in the design of the test framework. So the next slide, please. One of the concerns that we've had is in many of the testing programs we see there's not very good attention to the subtests, to defining the subtests, to getting accurate subtest scores, or to thinking about what they mean and how they're used. This is an example from an old test in California, the Golden State exam in biology, in which students were doing an experiment in biology, and they were tested in a multiple choice test, which is along the bottom scale. They were given a holistic evaluation of the experiment that they did, and then there were component results for each of different categories of their performance in the test. What we find here is that things go in different directions. That is, different aspects of the test, in fact, we're measuring different things in ways that make sense. Some of the things have to do with the content knowledge, some have to do with experimental skills, some are more deep thinking things. And if you wanted to get an overall picture of this test, you'd have to look very carefully at what's being measured and decide what kinds of subtests would be sensible. So the next slide, please. Talking about content, and I think that what we need to look at more deeply is the constructs that go into a test. By the constructs, we mean our understanding or description of how students learn. Learning is conceptualized as a progress toward higher levels of competence. And new knowledge is linked to existing knowledge. Deeper understanding are developed from and take the place of earlier understandings. This is another example from the California Golden State exams. In this case, it refers to algebra and shows only the top and the bottom description levels for these. And you can see that within each of these levels, there are different constructed, different views about the construction of this knowledge. Have to do with the correctness of what's done, communication, having to do with problem solving skills and so forth. And that what one sees is that all of these are relevant at all levels of the test. Okay, next slide. Here's an example from the writing assessment in the Australian National Literacy Survey. The writing achievement was being categorized into 5 levels, and you can see the performance descriptions for those levels. Again, this is more of a construct definition of what's being measured. The 2 diagrams, or the 2 pieces on the right, are the distributions of the scores for 2 different grade levels, grade level 3, 5. So we have an indication of what kinds of things are being learned. I think that this is partly an illustration of the importance of understanding what it is that people who are farther down the scale can do and can accomplish. It's not just whether to describe what the ultimate accomplishments of the best students are. Next slide. The comparability of stringency is something we want to emphasize. Tests can be easier or harder. This is sort of a circular definition, but they're harder if there are more low scores and more high scores. This is an example from NAEd, from Bob Lynn, in which we see the state tests for Colorado and Missouri and the NAEP tests. And clearly what's happened here is that the Colorado test is much less stringent than the Missouri test. And the NAEP test is sort of in between. But how did that happen? How does one interpret tests in which the stringency has been allowed to slip in this way? Go to the next slide. This is another Golden State example of a cut score map in which we take the scale for the test, compare it to the positions of the multiple choice questions, and to the cut score, or the scoring points for 2 writing samples. And we can see all in one picture here of this right map, what it means to be at different points on the scale in terms of what kinds of multiple choice questions are likely to be answered correctly, and where student scores are likely to be on the written responses. Next slide, please. This is an example from California, but for the current assembly, the current Smarter Balance results. These are the score point ranges for levels in ELA and math. I guess what I would say about these is that it's sort of a jumble of numbers. I don't know how you would try to interpret these numbers and these ranges. They're just going in different directions. Their intervals are not the same. There's nothing really here to get a handle on. One would much prefer to see this in terms of some kind of right map that shows what content is being achieved by students at different levels. Next slide. Another big issue for us in terms of the comparability is the reliability, and the reliability for different uses. And I want to divide that into the student reliability, which is measurement error due to interactions between students and items, or between groups of students and items. And what we think of as equating error, I use the term here wobble. That is to say that the equating, which depends on item samples and student samples and the models, creates variability in the placement of the scale. And that's a wobble from year to year. I think too often what's seen as differences in trends are in fact just technical problems in the equating. So one more slide here. We want to just emphasize how important it is to have some transparency in terms of comparability. We need to say who gets to know what's under the hood in an assessment system. The consumers need to have very clear understanding of what the reports present. The evaluators need to have good technical documentation and the ability to replicate results that are produced by vendors. Often this doesn't happen because of proprietary software or because documentation is simply not sufficiently detailed to make a replication. But that's part of transparency. So one more slide. Sorry, I'm going too long here. I just want to say the main questions about comparability and the need to think strategically about this. We have challenges in how to integrate interim or other classroom information. And my particular concern is how to get better subtest scores or how to get good subtest information. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Richard, for walking us through all these issues to think about within a single assessment system. Now I'm turning it over to Marion Perry, who will talk about across different assessment systems.
Thanks, Amy, and hi, everyone. So as Amy said, I'm going to take some of the concepts we've heard about in the early chapters and talk about it when we're looking at more of a large-scale system, but trying to compare one to another. So next slide, please. So what we're trying to do here is look at systems where we're trying to make comparisons across students, schools, districts, and states. And that's a big piece of it, and then Ed talked about it in his slides, is that the different questions have different implications as to, are we trying to make student-to-student comparison, school-to-school comparison, state-to-state comparisons. But the focus is on these required elements for comparability that I'll talk about in a minute, and then understanding the comparability of the scores at these different levels of aggregation, and then what are some of the psychometric constraints in making the inferences that we want to make when comparing these tests. And again, at what level do we want to make these inferences? And then I'm going to conclude with some examples from the Race to the Top consortia, NAEP, international assessments, specifically TIMSS and PISA, as well as comparing state high school summative assessments to ACT and SAT. Next slide, please. So what I pulled is the required elements for comparability, and the way I analyzed the different tests throughout the chapter is looking at the comparability of purpose, content, administration conditions, and psychometric properties, and try to give explanations of each of these using these examples that I showed you in the previous page. And so took various kinds of statements that we want to make about comparability and ran it through these different criteria. So the elements are spelled out a little more on the next pages. So next slide. So comparability of purpose, a lot of this has to do with stakes. Stakes can affect student preparation, student motivation. They can explain some of the differences in interim and summative tests and between state tests with promotion criteria and state tests that have no returned results. So for instance, a grade 10 high school test, when the high school test is only used for school accountability, when we're comparing that to an ACT or an SAT score, it may not be as comparable because the purpose is different for the student. They're not going to be as motivated for a school comparability test as they will for ACT and SAT, but there may be much more comparability and purpose between comparing ACT to SAT. Likewise, comparing a state accountability to a state accountability test will be more comparable than a state test to a state NAEP test where a student does not even get the score back. National to international may have different purposes for policymakers, so there may be a different reason of why we're involved in NAEP versus TIMSS, but from a student perspective, they're not going to see their score in either one of them. They probably don't see it as having different purposes. Next slide, please. Content. We're looking at the extent to which tests measure the same content standards. But even within that, some of what the Race to the Top consortia taught us is that even when they were built to the same content standards, the Common Core, they were not comparable because they had very different balances of representation in the blueprint. They focused on different parts of the content. So the breadth and depth of the standards and how you're assessing them plays a role. Developing the performance level descriptors and what you're calling proficiency plays a role. What subscores you can report out plays a role. Types of items that are in the test. Are you getting at open-ended items and deeper knowledge through those or not? And really thinking about what are they trying to say about student performance from the test results. All of this impacts comparability. Next slide, please. Administration conditions, even within the exact same test, we noticed in some of the early days of No Child Left Behind, we weren't seeing comparability within states giving the same test because districts had different rules about lengths of the testing window, whether the test was timed or untimed. We've had some issues with state versus NAEd because of what accommodations are permitted. We're looking at comparability of paper versus computers and within computers, the kinds of devices, screen size, mouse, etc. We also have to look at adaptive versus fixed form and thinking about things like state to state, when they have different rules about accommodations, can we make the same judgment? So this was certainly something the consortia had to deal with. Next slide, please. And finally, comparability of psychometric characteristics. And Richard talked about this in his presentation, but things like the reliability of test scores. If we're trying to compare a summative to an interim and the summative has a high reliability and interim is lower, what level of comparison can we make? How the test is modeled. Is it IRT? Is it classical? Is it diagnostic classification model? We ran into some of these questions when we were looking at the state summative assessment versus ACT and thinking about, because the psychometric model is so different, what kinds of comparisons can we make? So let me flip to show you some examples now. On the next slide is based on a study that we did in Florida where they were looking at comparing their grade 10 test, which in ELA is actually a grade 10 test that is required for graduation. In math, it's an Algebra 1 end of course test. But comparing those to the ACT and SAT to say, could we use one score in lieu of another? So we looked at what you see on the screen, various pieces of reliability. We looked at the length of the number of items in a form, the kinds of items in the form, the range of difficulties as one example. And next slide. Sorry, I should have ended that by saying we actually did run some comparability because I think we had hundreds of thousands in Florida of students taking 2 of those assessments. So we could run comparability analysis. Quick conclusion is almost no comparability. And then we looked at, for this paper, comparing our 3 main international assessments, the PISA, which is run by OECD, TIMSS, which is run through IEA, and PEARLS, which is also run through IEA. Looking at the age, looking at the grades that are hit, and then also when you look at this, think about comparing it back to the NAEP, because that's often what's done, but we sometimes have different students taking this. We have students taking them different times of year. It's another issue with NAEP, as NAEP is often given in the winter, state assessments in the spring, and then these international assessments can vary from the fall to the spring. The purposes, again, vary. The other interesting thing was the focus for PISA being more skills-based, while TIMSS and PEARLS were more curriculum-based. And then who we're comparing to, again, the length of the assessment and then how it's given are also issues we compared. And finally, in conclusion, just wanted to say focus on, to me, those big things are looking at some of the psychometric characteristics, the purpose, the content, and the administration conditions. Thank you, Amy.
Thank you so much, Marianne. And so now we're going to switch gears a little bit. We were talking about different types of tests as well as different types of assessment systems. And now we have several chapters that are looking at subgroup populations and comparability adjusting them. And Molly Faulkner-Bond is going to talk about the subgroup population of English learner students.
All right, thanks Amy, and thanks again to NCME for having us today. So I co-authored this chapter with my colleague Jim Soland at the University of Virginia and NWEA. And as Amy said, our chapter focused on comparability issues when assessing English learner students. And our chapter is organized into 3 topical buckets, which are shown here. So we address comparability issues related to academic content assessments, to assessments of English language proficiency, and to estimating growth on either of those constructs. Next slide, please. So the first thing to acknowledge about comparability issues with English learners is that it's complicated. Everything that has been said so far about comparability issues applies to this population, but also relative to students who aren't English learners, for this population, we just have more of everything in the mix. So more assessments in which they participate, more decisions that are made based on those assessments, and more reference groups to which one might wish to make a comparison. There's also comparability issues at the level, not quite ready yet, maybe previous slide. There are also comparability issues just at the level of the population itself. So we spend the first few pages of the chapter just reviewing the identification and reclassification process for English learners. And one of our main points is just to emphasize that EL status is itself a test-based decision. So whether or not a student is or is not an English learner depends on how they perform on a test that's chosen by their state relative to a cut score that's also chosen by their state. So even the question of who counts as part of the population varies across states, which is a comparability issue in itself. But there's more. So next slide, please. So just to run through kind of the different comparisons of interest one might wish to make for English learners. First, you have your kind of basic achievement gap comparisons where you're comparing English learners to non-English learners within the same state. And this would be on academic content assessments only. Next slide. Within that same state, you might also wish to compare the performance of different subgroups of English learners. So for example, students who speak Spanish versus speakers of other languages, or English learners who are enrolled in bilingual versus English-only programs. You might also want to compare English learners with and without disabilities. And so all of these comparisons could involve content assessment scores, ELP scores, or both. Next slide. You might also be interested in comparing the achievement or progress of English learners across states. So for example, English learners in Colorado versus Mississippi. And so here again, you could compare language achievement, content achievement, or both. And this is where those differences in identification criteria start to seep in as well. So here we're comparing the achievement of populations that have been identified using different criteria on assessments that also differ in terms of their content articulation, their performance standards, or both. Next slide. You may also be interested in comparing achievement gaps across states, so ELs versus non-ELs in state A versus B. Here again, mercifully, we're only on academic content assessments, but still lots of entry points for comparability issues. Next slide. And then finally, one just might be interested in looking at the progress or achievement of former English learners across different states. So these are students who have met their state standard for English proficiency and exited the English learner subgroup. And the number of students who meet the standard, as well as how long it takes students to meet it, both are topics of interest in terms of accountability and program quality. So it's relevant to look at variations across states along these lines. So hopefully you get the idea. This is complex, to say the least, and we do our best in the chapter to break down these comparisons into meaningful categories and then offer some considerations and recommendations for each, which I'll run through at just a high level in the remainder of my time. Next slide. So first we tackle comparability considerations for academic content assessments. And as I mentioned previously, the primary comparison of interest here is usually English learners to non-English learners within the same state. And the primary threat to such comparisons is the construct irrelevant variance that's introduced by the fact that English learners are tested in a language they're still learning. So particularly for kind of students at the lower end of the achievement spectrum, it's just difficult for us to tell whether their achievement is stemming from content knowledge or language proficiency or both. And obviously this gets doubly complex when we consider English learners who also have disabilities. The primary way that we as a field tend to address this comparability issue is through the use of linguistic accommodations that are designed to reduce the potential for language to create a barrier to access and achievement. And as other authors in the volume also discuss, these can be a little bit of a double-edged sword as their use may introduce new comparability concerns if they alter the focal construct on the test or impact students' interaction with the test in non-trivial ways. Next slide. So in light of the complexities around accommodations, we focus our recommendations in this chapter on the test and item development process, as well as a slightly more radical idea of even rethinking how students engage with content at all. But our logic here was to acknowledge that while accommodations are almost always going to be necessary for English learners, unless we kind of go whole hog on recommendation 3, the need for accommodations can be reduced or minimized if we attend to English learner students in intentional ways during the test development process. So one thing we do here is summarize the research on what kinds of item features are known to differentially affect English learners, things like very long item stems or phrases like which of the following. And we encourage developers to explicitly attend to these in things like the blueprint and the item development process so as to minimize the need for aftermarket accommodations, essentially, or adjustments for English learner students. Next slide. The second big section in our chapter focuses on English language proficiency assessment. We spend a little time describing the assessment landscape in this area and then flagging specific ways to, in which different ELP tests may produce scores that aren't directly comparable. A big point in this section is that on the one hand, the majority of states actually do use the exact same ELP assessment from the WIDA consortium, which is great because it does mean that the scores across those states are psychometrically comparable because they're based on the same test form. On the other hand, a lot of this comparability gets lost based on the fact that these assessments are primarily used for reclassification decisions, and those depend on state-specific cut scores. So every state gets to decide for itself where on the WIDA scale students attain proficiency. And this makes sense given the nature of that decision, but it just means that a score of, say, 450 on the WIDA assessment doesn't necessarily mean the same thing across states in the sense that it may mean different things about where that student is relative to proficiency in that state. Next slide. So based on those contextual considerations, our two recommendations for this section are to focus on comparability of use and interpretation for ELP assessments rather than psychometric comparability. And also just to reconsider how ELP is defined and measured altogether. So on this latter point, obviously, ESEA is fairly explicit about how we are supposed to measure language and how that should be defined, but it's just worth pointing out that other countries do it in different ways, and some would argue that the idea of measuring and teaching language in isolation from academic content sort of warps the construct and kind of misses the point of what we want students to learn and why we want them to learn it. So there are other ways we could do this, which could have their own comparability issues, but different ones than what we have now. Next slide. So in our final section, we just talk about estimating growth and achievement for English learners in both language and content. There's a lot in this section, but it mostly revolves around this concept of, again, reclassification or exiting the EL subgroup. And we kind of revisit the stakes of that decision and then talk about some psychometric decisions that have to be made to support it. One challenge I'll highlight is that growth is really hard to operationalize for the EL subgroup because students are constantly entering and exiting it. And typically we look at how many kids attain proficiency in a given year, but that doesn't tell us how long those kids or the kids who didn't reach proficiency have actually been in the EL subgroup. So next slide. So these are our recommendations in that area. And I think I'll just highlight our pie in the sky idea here was to try and think about how to measure and report growth in a way that is more based on individual student progress as opposed to the simple aggregate. So I'll stop there. Thanks again for listening, and I hope you find the book and the chapter useful.
Thank you so much, Molly. And now I'm turning it over to Maura O'Riordan, who's going to talk about comparability with regard to individuals with disabilities.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Maura O'Riordan, and I'm going to talk about the chapter that I worked on with Steve Cerisi on comparability when assessing individuals with disabilities. This chapter specifically mostly focused on comparing students with disabilities to students without disabilities working on the same assessment. Next slide, please. So first, to answer the question of why we need test accommodations in the first place, the comparability issue wouldn't really exist if they weren't in practice. So we use them. It's really it's a question of access. So the 2014 standards defines access as the notion that all test takers should have an unobstructed opportunity to demonstrate their standing on the constructs being measured. And without accommodations, students with disabilities or English learners might have characteristics unrelated to the construct being measured by the test that are hindering their ability to demonstrate their knowledge of the construct being measured. Next slide. So the two primary groups of students who receive test accommodations are individuals with disabilities and English learners. And as Molly discussed before, and I'll get into in this presentation a little bit, both of these groups are really diverse in their needs. So for example, students with disabilities could range from physical disabilities to attention disabilities to reading disabilities, and no one accommodation or one accommodation plan would work for all of those students. This brings up an issue of not just comparability between accommodations accommodated and non-accommodated assessments, but also comparability between all the different types of accommodations that are provided or the different groupings of accommodations that are being provided. There are 5 main types of accommodations. So they are changes in the presentation of test content, the setting in which a test is administered, the manner in which examinees provide responses, the amount of time given to examinees, and the use of additional resources or devices such as calculators. So as I said earlier, students could be given 1 or more of those accommodations. Typically they're given more, which increases the comparability challenges. And then one important distinction to make is that in this section, we're talking about accommodations which do not alter the construct being assessed, and they're often confused with modifications which do alter the construct being assessed and therefore make comparability even more challenging or even impossible. Next slide. So I'm going to talk through the main points that Steve and I made in our chapter, and the first is the relationship between validity and accommodations. In the 2014 standards, it's made very clear that in order to have a strong validity argument, it's important that you have a clear definition of the purpose and the construct of the assessment, and that's equally true for when defending accommodations or accommodation use on assessments. In terms of validity, we talk about 2 main threats to validity being construct underrepresentation and construct irrelevant variance. And then 2 pieces that are important to consider when using accommodations on assessments is score invariance, meaning that the scores have the same meaning for all test takers, regardless of whether or not they used accommodations, and that same construct is being measured for all test takers. And we'll talk a little bit later about how to evaluate that. And then related to validity is the idea of fairness, which essentially is just ensuring that the test conditions do not advantage nor disadvantage any test takers. For accommodations, that would mean that students who are using the accommodations don't have an unfair advantage over students who don't have those accommodations, and that students who are not receiving the accommodations are not disadvantaged. So if a student needs the accommodation and they're not receiving it, that might be a disadvantage to them. So ensuring that neither of those are happening is important. Next slide. So this leads us to a psychometric oxymoron, which is the idea of the accommodated standardized test. By its very definition, a standardized test should be as similar as possible for all test takers, from development all the way through scoring and use of the scores. And we're using accommodations theoretically to promote fairness in testing by allowing all students to access the test. But the question gets raised of whether those accommodations are providing an unfair advantage to some students. Next slide. So this is really kind of part of the comparability issue, is at what point does providing accommodations alter the standardization of the test so that the comparability is no longer possible, but we need them to be able to provide access for all test takers, which then allows for the scores to be more comparable. So in our chapter, we go through an extensive literature review discussing the different ways that accommodations are evaluated. And really, to demonstrate comparability, it's important to evaluate the accommodations for the specific tests and their purpose. And one example that we give is using a differential boost hypothesis to demonstrate validity evidence of the accommodations. So you see on the right, differential boost hypothesis would be that the dotted line, the students with disabilities group, is showing more of a score increase than the solid line, the students without disabilities, when they receive the accommodation. So we're looking for, we recognize that possibly or probably all students will improve when they receive an accommodation, but in order to justify use of an accommodation or demonstrate that it's not providing an unfair advantage, we're looking for that difference in the improvement in score. And then it's also noted in our chapter that comparability must focus on the specific purpose of the test. So for example, if purpose is determining mastery, the comparability of the specific scores is less important than the comparability of mastery designations between students who receive accommodations and those who do not. Next slide, please. We also talk about how technology and test accommodations can work together to increase accessibility. So embedded supports are one way that accessibility can be increased for all students, rather than just providing accommodations to some. And this kind of eliminates the issue of comparability if all students have access to the same accessibility supports. then the need to compare accommodated versus non-accommodated scores becomes not a problem anymore. One example of a test that does this, has a large volume of these, is Smarter Balanced. And the use of these embedded supports really allows for more universally designed tests, which would be allowing all students to have access to the same accessibility features, and ideally the students who need them would use them. However, technology does create the possibility for other comparability issues, such as access to technology and practice with or knowledge of how to use that technology, both in terms of answering questions on the general test and then also accessing and using the accommodations on the computer-based test. Next slide, please. So we conclude our chapter with some future considerations, some recommendations for future considerations. The first, these are coming mainly from the literature review and then also just from discussions throughout the writing. So the first is that the congruence between accommodation assignment and what students need should be looked into more. So usually accommodations are assigned based on teacher recommendations, and we recommend that more research be done into those teacher recommendations versus the testing purposes and seeing how those work together. And then secondly, we recommend that we increase accommodation access by providing instruction to students in how to use accommodations. This is especially relevant for computer-based testing, but really applies to all testing situations. If students don't know how to use the accommodations that they're being provided, then they're not very useful. And then finally, in order to decrease the comparability challenges that we see, we recommend increasing accessibility for all students, which would be providing access to the accessibility features to students without disabilities through universal features. Next slide. So just thank you, and these are our emails if you have any questions.
Thank you so much, Maura. I'm going to turn it over now to Pradria Erica Khan, who's going to talk about comparability in multilingual and multicultural contexts.
Great, thanks, Amy. Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon. And first, thanks to NCME for organizing these presentations and making them available virtually. And thanks to the National Academy of Education for including us in this important volume. Our chapter focused on comparability issues in assessments in multilingual and multicultural contexts. I want to acknowledge my co-author, Han Hui Por, who is ready for your questions on the chat box. She can respond to them while the presentation is going on. Next slide, please, Amy. Earlier presentations highlighted key comparability issues, including comparability on the same test for aggregated scores and comparability issues in assessing special populations. Comparability issues in multilingual and multicultural contexts includes all of these issues. Therefore, they are in addition to and often interacts with these other comparability issues. In the chapter, we highlight the complexity of comparability when we have students coming from multilingual and multicultural contexts. Discuss the impact of these issues on the interpretation and use of assessment results, and make recommendations for creating comparable scores. Next slide, please. Performance on assessments is never solely about what students know and are able to do. Performance is an interaction between the individuals and the assessments, which both the individual and the assessment are firmly grounded in the complex social cultural context of the assessment that is taking place. Next slide, please. This interaction between students and assessment is impacted by both what the assessment entails with respect to content, linguistic properties, mode, format, as well as the learning and life experiences of the individuals taking the assessment, including their perceptions of the assessment situation, the importance given to the assessment, and their opportunities to learn the relevant content. This interaction creates complications in interpreting assessment results as indicators of proficiency in the targeted construct. Therefore, comparisons of groups' performances, an important goal for many assessments, requires disentangling the extent to which the performance differences for the groups we're comparing are due to differences in the targeted constructs and the degree to which they are results of differences in measurement. Next slide, please. In multilingual contexts, the comparability issues are multiplied. When tests are adopted and administered to different student populations, in essence, different forms of tests are administered to different student populations. Interpreting differences in performance needs to take into account the language differences that may be created by the adaptation process, as well as the differential impact of the language on the students taking the test in different languages. In essence, we need to take into account the degree to which we have equivalent measurement of the individuals from different language backgrounds. Next slide, please. So in comparability across different languages and cultural groups, measurement equivalence is central to the validity and fairness of interpretations and use of scores. Lack of sufficient equivalence compromises validity of inferences we can draw on the basis of assessment results, and in particular, any kind of comparative claims we want to make. Next slide, please. Three considerations are critical in measurement equivalence. One is equivalence of constructs, equivalence of tests, equivalence of testing conditions. Equivalence of constructs refers to the equivalence of the definition of the construct for different cultural groups, as well as how those constructs are operationalized in different contexts and for different groups. Test equivalence refers to equivalence of meaning, format, relevance, intrinsic interest, and familiarity of the context the items are presented in. And equivalence of testing conditions refers to the administration conditions, the test format, the impact of speededness, to what extent the speededness is relevant to different groups from different cultures, and equivalence of other response styles, such as acquiescence and tendency to guess, and so on. All of these three types of equivalence are necessary for measurement equivalence, and lack of equivalence in any one of these is expected to lead to incomparability of scores across groups. Next slide, please. In the chapter, we identify 7 steps in creating comparable scores across language and cultural groups. It's important to remember that comparability of scores is optimized if we prioritize this goal from the beginning stages of an assessment. The first step is whether and to what extent the targeted construct has similar meaning, definition, and operationalization in the considered languages and cultures. This equivalence needs to be examined conceptually as well as empirically. There are different test development methods when we consider developing multiple language versions of tests. Involving bilingual experts in developing multiple language versions of tests concurrently, that is, developing multiple language versions at the same time, not one after another, that is, not just adapting tests, we're expected to lead to more culturally and linguistically appropriate assessments. Similarly, adapting tests require careful consideration of who conducts the adaptation and what processes are followed. Evaluation of adaptations should be done by bilingual and cultural experts, and revisions should be documented. In addition to linguistic and cultural reviews, empirical evidence of measurement equivalence should be documented through analysis such as differential item functioning and factor analysis. And finally, score comparability should not be assumed across different language groups, and empirical linking studies should be conducted. Next slide, please. As a final note, our chapter intended to highlight the importance of establishing comparability for making comparative claims based on assessments conducted in multiple languages and across cultures. We didn't get a chance to present today, but we do discuss in the chapter new modes of assessments that includes digitally based assessments, which may involve interactivity with avatars or other individuals. This requires taking into account a wider range of considerations, including digital literacy, technology access, interactive engagements, and cultural and language differences, in addition to the other ones that we have highlighted. Others earlier on in this presentation refer to remote administration that we need to take into account in the comparability across languages, as well as AI scoring, artificial intelligence-based automated scoring. Finally, it's important to remember that validity evidence, comparability evidence is not constant. Any kind of validity evidence we have regarding comparability of scores across languages and cultures need to be tentative, and such evidence need to be periodically updated given the changes in society, education systems, technology, and the overall socio-cultural context of the assessments. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that summary of your chapter. I'm going to turn it over to Randy Bennett, who talks about interpreting test score comparisons.
Thanks very much. This talk is titled, as Amy said, and in it I'll reiterate many of the points that my colleagues have been making. So I'll begin by reiterating on the next slide that getting meaning from test results requires some type of comparison, be it to the performance of other test takers, one's own past performance, or some absolute standard like a proficiency cut or growth target. And indeed, a common comparative frame is generally needed even to aggregate assessment results. We can make the strongest comparisons, next slide please, when the same measure is given under substantively the same conditions, which here includes purpose, to comparable student samples at the same point in time. Comparisons become weaker as any of these conditions begin to be violated. I'll briefly discuss three types of divergence from the base case. The first is when nominally equivalent measures diverge in form. Such differences can be literal, as when a test version has the same name but are materially dissimilar from one another. So several versions of the test exist, materially dissimilar from one another, but called the same thing. Language of presentation offers a great example. PISA 2018 was given in some 111 language versions for reading, but all of those language versions are called PISA 2018 reading. Delivery method is another instance where the test may be given in different versions on paper and computer, via different accommodations in Braille and large type, in audio form, and as a last instance, a test version may exist that has eliminated a portion of the test, as is true in some of the state consortia assessments where the performance task or performance section has been removed, but the test is still called by its original name. A second type of divergence from this base case is when the same literal test is given, but with different scoring methods, for example, for the constructed response portions, in one state being scored by human raters and another state being scored by automated means or a combination of the two. A third type of divergence is when the test is literally the same and the scoring method is the same, but population differences potentially cause the test itself to have a different meaning for some groups. And this was, I think, part of the point of the Urchikan and Poor chapter. So the language and culture of a group might be different from the language and culture that is presumed by the test. A second instance of this is differential opportunity to learn, which has occurred under COVID-19. This year's students have had less opportunity to learn than last year's, affecting the meaning of growth comparisons, for example, to previous years. A second type of divergence occurs when results are compared across instruments that are more than nominally different because they diverge in the content and processes being measured. And some of my colleagues talked about this occurring across assessment systems or between tests being used for the same purpose, such as PARCC and SMARTer or ACT and SAT. And it also occurs, of course, between measures used for the same purpose where one measure was originally created for another use, as when college admissions measures are used for state accountability and then compared with results from prior state tests built to measure content standards directly. A third type of divergence can occur when the same instrument is administered, but due only to divergence in selection processes, the student samples diverge from one another enough to constitute different populations. And this can occur across states where different percentages of students opt to take a given admissions test, making mean performance on the admissions test in one state no longer comparable to mean performance on another admissions test or the same admissions test in another state. It can occur across school districts with different state assessment participation rates that vary by SES, CL status, disability status, or race ethnicity, making comparisons across districts taking the same test tenuous. And it can occur across states on NAEP with different accommodations policies, as Mary Ann Perry mentioned. In all such cases, we can adjust the strength of the comparative claims that we make. And we can adjust them with respect to two things. First, the extent to which the factors that make for comparability are departed from, and second, the extent of logical and empirical evidence as to the effect of such departures. Our claims can be adjusted in terms of level of confidence based on either of these two factors. So a high confidence claim might be one for which there is little or no divergence from those factors, or it might be one in which there is some divergence, but good support for the comparison we wish to make given the divergence that's occurred. So for example, with two test forms that are made up of materially different items, but built to be content parallel, the equating of test scores is good support for the comparison. A lower confidence claim might be plausible given current theory, but have limited or no empirical backing, and obviously claims of this type should be more tentatively stated. Let's take a brief look at one example of what I would consider to be stronger versus weaker claims. So the comparison I wish to make is between males and females on 8th grade NAEP writing assessment given in 2011. I think a well-supported claim would be that females scored higher than males at the 8th grade level when composing online, on-demand essays to persuade, explain, or convey experience. That claim, I think, is well supported because it sticks very close to the facts of the situation. A claim that I think would require more evidence is that female students write better than males. This comparison, I think, would require evidence that the NAEP 2011 results extended to other grades beyond the 8th grade, that they extended to writing on paper because that assessment was only given on computer, and that they extended to other writing purposes than the 3 that were assessed. A claim that I would not recommend is that female students received better writing instruction than males, because that's a causal claim that NAEP is really not designed to support. So in summary, next slide please, test score comparisons are inevitable and indeed desirable because getting meaning from test results requires some type of comparison. Comparisons are strongest in the presence of the factors I mentioned, and departure from any of those factors begins to weaken the comparison. The more severe and numerous those departures, the less defensible the comparison becomes. In making test score comparisons, I suggest first, next slide please, articulating the rationale for the comparison, ascertaining if it's appropriate given the technical methods used, stating a supporting rationale that's based on logic and evidence, and warning audiences against inappropriate inferences. Comparisons will be most tenable when they stay closest to the facts, to the measures, the populations, the conditions, including the purpose, and the time points used. And obviously, as claims begin to stray from those facts or otherwise become more general, their reasonableness starts to decline. Thanks very much.
Thank you. I'm now going to turn it over to Jim Pellegrino to talk about the major findings from the volume.
Had to unmute myself. I'm going to be very brief because we're almost at the end and I want to at least allow a couple of minutes for some Q&A responses. So you've had the chance now to hear from my co-editors of the volume, Amy Berman and Ed Hartle, as well as authors of each of the chapters in the volume. And even though it was a brief presentation of the substance of their chapter, I think you get from this a sense that the volume offers many recommendations to help judge and to improve comparability of assessments across jurisdictions, among populations, and over time. One of the things that Amy, Ed, and I did as well was to generate an executive summary for the volume and had the goal of trying to capture some of the important themes and findings that cut across multiple chapters. As you listen to this today, I'm sure you heard and authors referred back to each other in terms of common themes. So on this slide, you see the 5 topic areas that we covered in the executive summary. And because of timing, I'm not going to present anything about the key points on relative to each of these. I'm simply going to say that we tried to then pull out relevant cross-cutting themes, many of which you heard. And so the executive summary tries to capture some of that. I'm going to suggest, Amy, you simply jump to the last slide, which has the way to access the volume, and then we open it up for responses to some of the questions in the chat.
So this is how to access the volume. If you go to, I would say, naeducation.org/comparability. I am going to stop sharing my screen because I think it will be for the Q&A to see everybody. So the first question in here is from Andrew Ho. Andrew, it's a long question. Do you want to unmute yourself and ask the question? I think you thought it would go to Leslie.
No, I just put in the chat that I defer my questions to the happy hour that we're having virtually next Tuesday at 5:30 p.m. So I'll leave it to a shorter question.
Okay. I'm not sure so Carolyn Fidelman wrote for Molly or for Kadriette. There is some push and pull between exclusion and inclusion of marginally proficient EL students from reading tests. How can we improve our decision before the test session date around the advantages of providing them the opportunity to show their nascent ability in a language arts reading test with that of stressing them out? Err on the side of the first in order to get some data, and then how can the excluded students best be represented in the data set from time 1 to time 2?
Hi, Carolyn. So I will just say this is sort of a central tension for English learners on content assessments, and we do spend some time in our chapter acknowledging this. It is very challenging. We talk about how the sort of motivation for including English learners in content assessments is sort of indirect and really focuses on trying to make sure that they get access to the general curriculum, that historically these students were often excluded from assessments, and doing so often adversely impacted their opportunity to learn. So it's sort of the scores are potentially not even really the point of including them, but it's more to try and ensure that they are accessing the curriculum. So I think your question is a fair one, and one of my recommendations would be just don't put too much stress or emphasis or attach too many stakes to the performance, particularly of low proficiency English learners, in part because we kind of, what their actual score isn't really the point of why we're testing them. And so particularly given comparability issues and validity issues, we maybe just don't want to put a ton of stock in that and rely on other measures of what the students know to make the kinds of decisions that we want to make for those students.
Yeah, my question is, I guess, more on the kind of assessment that I'm involved in, which is an NCES longitudinal study. So we're not making decisions about students in this case. We're providing data set for researchers, So in other words, these students and even some disability students are kind of a moving target. And my problem is, when do they legitimately take their place in the data set? Because they're actually never going to be probably as proficient as someone whose mother tongue was English. Probably not going to get there. Yet, should their scores be considered comparable, and at what point, to their peers? And I guess in our kind of data set, as opposed to, I know the focus here is on state assessment, but it's always been a problem for me in my thinking, and especially that's part about exclusion and stressing students out by giving them something that might be too hard for them.
Amy, I could speak to that a little bit. There are, as Molly pointed out, there are multiple reasons for including students from different backgrounds in these assessments. But ultimately, the decision about, with respect to interpreting appropriate interpretation of assessment results, to what extent inclusion improves that validity versus adds noise that is not only fair to student with respect to participating, taking the test under conditions that might make them very uncomfortable, but as well as their performance may not be an accurate indicator of their knowledge, targeted knowledge, skills, and abilities. So it is important for us to investigate the extent to which, in a math assessment, science assessment, the degree to which we're actually assessing students' language skills, and the kind of error and inappropriate conclusions that kind of inclusion may lead to.
One other thing I would just throw in very quickly is one of the things we mentioned in our chapter too is that building on something you said, Carolyn, we tend to assume that language plays no role whatsoever for native speakers, but that's probably not, I mean, that's an assumption that I'll just say we never test. And particularly for lower achievers, we just don't know what the role of language is. And so one way you could try to get at that is measure language for everyone, and then you could have sort of more directly comparable information.
Well, I see that we're over time and I don't have any more questions in the chat. If somebody does have a question that they would like to ask and stick it in the chat, they're more than welcome to do so. So I want to thank NCME on behalf of my co-editors and all of the authors. Thank you so much for hosting us today and hearing about this volume.
And please note the link for this evaluation in the chat. Thank you.
Yes.
Thanks everyone for participating today. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.
All right.
Thank you.